Looking at a fragile old lady, would you ever expect her to be able to turn into a cold-blooded murderer? Today we're talking about Dorothea Puente, who took the lives of countless people and buried them in her backyard. Then we're taking a look at Tamara Samsonova, who killed not just her husband, but also her best friend in a fit of rage. Lastly, we're introducing you to Sandra Layne, also known as the Killer Granny, who gave grandparents everywhere a bad name.
I used to be a very good person at one time.
Miss Samsonova, what can you tell us about the murders? Were you involved in any way? Excuse me.
To the outside world, Dorothea Puente was the kindest, most gentle old lady you could ever hope to run into. But what most people couldn't tell by the looks of her was the darkness that she had hidden within. Born in San Bernardino County, California, Dorothea had a rough childhood to say the least. Both of her parents were chronic alcoholics who abused her in their fits of rage. As a young girl, Dorothea was often left to fend for herself. Sometimes she would go days without eating because her parents would be too occupied with their own selves and their addictions. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was just 8 years old, and only a few days later, her mother died in a motorcycle crash due to heavy intoxication. Along with her siblings, Dorothea was sent to an orphanage and was later taken in by some relatives. She had already learned to fend for herself at that point. When she was 16 years old, Dorothea started doing sex work in a motel to make some money to support herself. To make herself sound interesting, she would make up different identities and lie to people about things like coming from a family of 18 children. Somehow, she made her way safely into adulthood when she started seeing 22-year-old soldier Fred McFall. And just after a few months of dating, the couple got married in Reno. Again, Dorothea lied about her name on their marriage certificate and pretended to be a 30-year-old woman named Shirley A. Ricilli. Her bad luck followed her into her marriage. 2 years in, her husband passed away due to a heart attack. To cope with her husband's loss and all the financial burden that followed, Dorothea started forging checks. However, she ended up getting caught red-handed and was sentenced to a year in jail. She only served 6 months and was eligible for parole. But as soon as she got out of jail, she found a new man. Despite having a short-lived relationship, Dorothea became pregnant. When she had her baby girl, she felt she wasn't ready to be a mom, so she gave her up for adoption. And a few years on from that, she married a new man named Axel Johansson. And that was the start of a violent relationship that brought out the ugly side of Dorothea like no other. What's strange is that despite all of this, she continued her street work. When the police caught her at a brothel, she was sentenced to 90 days. This is when Dorothea really started spiraling out of control. She began consuming illegal substances and getting into trouble with authorities. This is likely what led to the end of her marriage. But soon she married another man named Roberto Puente. Sadly, Roberto ended up cheating on Dorothea multiple times, and that's how their relationship ended. Dorothea was 40 years old at this point, and this is when she chose to go through a complete transformation. Becoming a devout Christian and working as a nurse's aide, she took care of disabled and elderly people in their homes. She progressed in her career and opened a boarding house for the elderly inside her own home. She would let them stay as tenants. It seemed like she had turned her life around, but no. This is where her crimes went up a notch. She started doing the most despicable things you could ever think of. When one of her tenants, named Ruth Monroe, passed away in Dorothea's house, people didn't think much of it. The authorities ruled the death as a self-infliction after finding traces of illegal substances in her body.
When we first met her, she seemed like a nice person, real friendly. Mom had a little bit of money, and Dorothea was talking about opening a restaurant, a little cafe at the corner bar. So her and Mom went in on it together, but Dorothea kept saying that it wasn't making money. She kept hitting her for more money, more money. Mom didn't want to live alone, so she had us move her into Dorothea's place as a roommate.
Everyone knew that Ruth was not an alcoholic, and Dorothea had agreed to adopt her. The two had grown quite close when she lived at the boarding house, and Ruth, whom she lovingly called Chief, would do anything that Dorothea asked her to. She would water her plants, take out her trash, and even help her cover her basement floor with concrete slabs. So, what happened to her?
I would stop by there every day after work, and everything was fine up until the last 3 days. The last 3 days, I saw Mom had a drink in her hand. And my mom didn't drink. Alcohol actually bothered Mom. She was allergic to alcohol. And she said Dorothea had fixed her a drink to calm her nerves. That next morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, was when I got the phone call from my sister saying that my mom died.
Did Dorothea get rid of her when she stopped being useful to her? The police returned back a month later with a load of evidence to prove that it wasn't substance abuse that killed Ruth, but Dorothea had drugged her and stolen from her, which was a pattern she had developed with her clients. All of them would drop dead for no reason, with their benefit checks being cashed by Dorothea.
When they did the autopsy, the amount of drugs that were in my mother were all at toxic levels. She poisoned her, and I think it was over time, with those drinks, little by little, putting it in her system.
After being sent to jail once again, Dorothea spent her time talking to a pen pal that she had found. And once she was released in 1985, the man named Everson Gilmouth was the one to come out and pick her up, expecting to get married to who he thought was the love of his life. But like clockwork, Gilmouth disappeared a few months later. And that was the same time when Dorothea hired a new worker to help her with renovations around the house, which included constructing a long box with a lid that she claimed was for trash. The next day, she asked her worker to load the now full box into her truck so they could dump it on the side of the road. Well, the only thing that box contained was Gilmouth's dead body. Dorothea got away with the crime, and the body wasn't discovered until 1986, when a fisherman saw it floating in the water. It took authorities around 3 more years to identify Gilmouth, and in a guise to protect herself, Dorothea kept writing letters to him, pretending that everything was okay, so his family would never suspect her. At the same time, she kept collecting his pension, since that's why she started the relationship in the first place.
She knew all the magic words to say to these government officials or people working for social services. Remember, record keeping in 1985 is not what it is today. She had been married 4 times. At various times, her married name was Dorothea McCall, Dorothea Johansson, Dorothea Montalvo. So sometimes law enforcement agencies didn't exactly know exactly what somebody had on their record. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't.
While Gilmouth's body was still being identified by the police, Dorothea continued her boarding house scam, and that's what eventually got her into trouble.
An officer went over to 1426 F Street to take a missing persons report. Spoke to Dorothea, spoke to everybody, and they all said the same thing, that Bert had left with a relative. All of them, same story. But one of the boarders slipped the officer a note.
In November 1988, the police came to her house looking for 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya, a disabled man who had decided to stay in Dorothea's home before mysteriously disappearing.
There's one or two things I can surmise, okay? And that is, Mr. Montoya is dead.
No, he's not.
Okay, missed that. I'm just saying, I'm trying to surmise this, and then we'll try to clear this up. That he is dead. And that either John McCauley or what is it, Mervyn,
John, no.
either killed him, or that maybe he meant foul play by your hands. That's my alternatives. I don't know. But my other alternative is that the fact that somewhere in that backyard, Dorothea, that he's lying. Maybe along with other people?
No.
Okay. And I'm also going to tell you that we had this same information a year ago. A year ago? Yes. A year ago. So, what I'm telling you is not new to me.
Monday, can I hire a contractor to go in and tear everything down and dig it up to prove to you that there's nobody there?
If there any digging has to be done, we're going to do the digging.
Oh,
Okay.
In search of Montoya, the police found a patch of disturbed soil in Dorothea's garden. And when they dug it up, lo and behold, there was Alvaro's body, rotting away.
At one point, I started finding pieces of garbage, eggshells, paper, cigarette butts. As I was digging, I looked up, I saw Dorothea standing out on the balcony on the second floor. And she was just staring at me. And then I started finding pieces of cloth, and I would pull them up, and they were kind of a light pinkish color. And I kept pulling these pieces of cloth up, so I set them in a pile. My shovel had struck something hard. I decided to get down in the hole, brace myself, grab this with my hands, and yank on it. And when it broke loose, I could see it had a ball in the end, and it was a femur bone. It was a human femur bone.
And not just that, but the police also found a bunch of other bodies buried away in the same patch, proving that the seemingly kind landlady was actually a cold-blooded murderer who wanted nothing but money out of her tenants.
You know what I heard? I heard, hey, Dorothea over at 1426 F Street, killing people and burying them in their backyard. How do you explain the body in the backyard?
I don't know.
2.5 feet down.
I don't
with
know.
clothing
I
and
don't
everything
know.
with it. How?
When you find out how old it is and see that I didn't have anything to do with that,
Dorothea,
sir, I don't know anything
I'm going to
about
ask you right now again. Are there any other bodies
it. No.
in your backyard?
Not that I didn't even know that one was there.
The police charged Dorothea with a total of 9 murders, and she ended up receiving 2 death sentences. During her trial, it was found that she tortured her tenants by overdosing them, and once they would die, she would hire workers to help her bury the bodies and get rid of the evidence. And since most of her victims were addicts and homeless people, no one really noticed their disappearance, which just goes to show how diabolical she really was. The evidence was just overwhelming at this point, and while a group of people believed that the old woman should be let go and treated a little gently because of her age, the judge completely ruled against it, and Dorothea was sent to Chowchilla Women's Prison, where she passed away in March 2011 at the age of 82. A fitting end to a horrific tale. But what's strange is that until the very end, Dorothea maintained her innocence, claiming that all her tenants had died because of either natural causes or the consequences of their own addictions. Known to the world as the Granny Ripper, Tamara Samsonova was nothing but pure evil. In 2015, the world was stunned to know that this elderly lady, who looked like she could barely hurt a fly, had committed some of the most heinous crimes one could ever imagine. Most of us have subconsciously created an image of how a serial killer should look like, but the truth is, one size doesn't fit all. And Tamara certainly didn't fit into any stereotype. Tamara's crimes came to light in 2015 when it was discovered that she was behind a string of brutal murders. Tamara was from Moscow. She lived in St. Petersburg with her husband, Alexei Samsonova, and worked for a travel agency. Everything in her life seemed completely okay until one day her husband mysteriously disappeared. Tamara then started making rounds to the local police, begging them to look for him. Sadly, though, the investigation led nowhere, and the case turned cold. After her husband was presumed dead, Tamara decided to rent out a room in her apartment, and for a while everything was fine. But then, in September 2003, she ended up murdering one of her tenants in a fit of rage. The victim was a 44-year-old man from Norilsk, and Tamara hid his body by dismembering it and chucking away the pieces on the streets near her house. Following that, her temper only worsened. She became friends with 79-year-old Valentina Nikolaevna Ulanova, who agreed to let Tamara move into her house while her place was being renovated. The two developed a great friendship, and Tamara loved living at her place. So much so that she just didn't want to move out. Soon enough, Ulanova got tired of the whole arrangement and asked her to move out. This didn't sit well with Tamara, who decided to poison the woman she called her friend, the woman who had let her into her house when she needed help. Tamara somehow convinced the pharmacist to sell her phenazepam, a sedative used to treat mental disorders. She put a ton of it in Ulanova's salad that she had bought for her under the guise as a peace offering to resolve their conflict. Tamara then took care of Ulanova's body by chopping her up into pieces with 2 knives and a saw. She first chopped off her head and then sawed her in half. She then took multiple trips to put pieces of her body in bags and scattered them around to make sure that no one traced the murder back to her. But for some odd reason, she left pieces of her corpse lying around her house. This blunder is what sealed her fate for good. It was in July 2015 when a man stumbled upon a body with severed limbs wrapped in a bathroom curtain at a pond by Ulanova's house. The body was identified a day later, and of course the police traced it all down to Tamara. They then broke into her house, finding traces of Ulanova's blood in her bathroom, and the final nail in the coffin was her missing shower curtain. And all of this was enough for Tamara to be arrested immediately. An investigation was launched, and the police came across footage of Tamara dragging a big garbage bag outside of her apartment, proving her to be guilty without any doubt. Soon enough, the police also linked the murder of her 44-year-old tenant to her, and it was also suspected that Tamara had killed her own husband before pretending he had gone missing. Tamara admitted to killing her tenant in her diary, writing, "I killed my tenant, Volodya, cut him into pieces in the bathroom with a knife, put the pieces of his body in plastic bags, and threw them away." The journal also contained a bunch of entries that revealed that Tamara had murdered 10 other people. According to the neighbors, she had previously spent time in a psychiatric hospital and often lied about her identity for unknown reasons. The police also discovered a host of ebooks on black magic and astrology, which made this case all the more bizarre. When questioned, though, she admitted to all of her crimes, even going into detail about Ulanova's murder, saying that she had given her an overdose of sleeping pills and dismembered her body while she was still alive. When asked why she killed her friend, Tamara claimed that they broke out into a disagreement over unwashed dishes, and that is what unhinged her. In her first court appearance, Tamara made it look like she was well prepared for this day, saying that she had been waiting 10 years for this moment to come and that it was all deliberate. Her crimes, as well as the circumstances that led to her arrest. Throughout her trial, she was always confused and erratic, leading the authorities to believe that she was mentally unstable. As the investigations went on, even more brutal details came to light as the police found Tamara guilty of feeding on her victims and taking part in cannibalism. All of her victims were found to have their lungs removed, which Tamara admitted to eating. And while she admitted to 13 crimes, the police believe that the number could have been as high as 21. She was ultimately declared mentally competent, and instead of being sent to jail for her crimes, Tamara was sent to multiple psychiatric hospitals where she remains to this day. She has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which is what led her to ruthlessly kill and dismember without conscience.
Sandra Layne deserves the maximum penalty allowed. Please do not show mercy on her.
It was an emotional day in the court. Sandra Layne looking shocked by the very real possibility that she will die in prison.
I know what I've done. I can't take it back.
Popularly known as the Granny with a Gun, Sandra Layne brutally took the life of her own grandson. A small, frail, 74-year-old woman, Sandra Layne's neighbors knew her as a sweet old lady who loved her family more than anything else. So no one could have seen it coming when she ended up killing one of her own in a fit of rage. So, what went down?
I wonder if you really felt so violated and so afraid and a need to shoot. Why did you keep shooting him?
In May 2012, 17-year-old Jonathan Hoffman was shot 3 times in the abdomen, once in his chest and once again in his arm. The injuries he had sustained were too much for him to handle, and he passed away on the spot. The perpetrator of the crime? His very own grandmother, who claimed to have done this for his own good. Jonathan had moved into his grandmother's house in 2012 when things at his home had gotten too overwhelming for him to handle. His sister had developed brain cancer, which is why his parents made the difficult decision of moving to Arizona to get her the treatment that she needed. But Jonathan didn't want to move. He didn't want his life to be uprooted, so he argued to stay back in Michigan. This led to a huge fight at home. It was then that Grandma Sandra offered to take him in. Sandra Layne was a 74-year-old retired school teacher who wanted to give her grandson the life he wanted. But what she hadn't realized was that, like any other teenager, Jonathan was going through a rebellious phase. He had a substance abuse problem and was addicted to synthetic marijuana. He had started using it way before things at home started getting bad. But Sandra was determined to fix things. She was on a mission to get Jonathan to pay attention in school, fix his grades, graduate on time, and start living a healthier life. But at the end of the day, she couldn't put a stop to his substance abuse. The final straw came when Jonathan called 911 while he was tripping on mushrooms, convincing the dispatchers that he was dying. He was shifted to the hospital while his mother flew in from Arizona, and Sandra just didn't know how to tell her daughter that this was all too much for her. Sick and tired of her grandson's constant hallucinogenic trips and rowdy behavior, she told his mother to take him back with her. It was later claimed by Jonathan's mother that no such conversation ever took place, and Sandra was still very determined to help the young boy get back on track. Jonathan was extremely defiant at this point. He was constantly consuming, and during one of his binges, the police caught him with a substance in his car, and he was put on probation for regular testing. During all of this, there was growing tension between the two. The grandfather was also present and saw what was happening in the house, but he chose to stay out of all arguments. But things just seemed to spiral out of control due to Jonathan's extremely volatile attitude. During one fight, things got so bad that Sandra had to call the police to keep the boy from harming her in any way. So it was evident that Sandra couldn't handle the situation anymore. The best thing to do at this point would have been to send her grandson to rehab, or she could have forced his parents to come back home, or his teachers could have been involved. But instead, she decided to take matters into her own hands, in the worst way possible. Sandra went ahead and got herself a semi-automatic gun. She started taking shooting lessons at the gun range and hid the whole thing from Jonathan and her husband, both of whom didn't know there was a gun hidden in their house. After Jonathan failed one of his court-mandated tests, he was afraid and wanted to move to Arizona to be with his parents. However, the police stopped him from doing so. Sandra kept him under house arrest, hoping to detox him from the substances.
I called 911 and I told him I hear gunfire back here.
Berger has lived next door to Fred and Sandra for 14 years. He was one of the last people to talk with 17-year-old Jonathan Hoffman before Layne killed him.
I figured I would call Fred and find out if he heard the same thing. But the young man answered the phone and said, "My grandmother just shot me in the chest."
In the midst of the rising tensions and the daily squabbles at home, Jonathan decided to step out of the house to meet a friend. Sandra tried to force him back. He outrightly refused and continued to get ready. Finding no other option, Sandra brought out the gun to scare the young boy into obedience. To her surprise, Jonathan was unfazed and still adamant to leave. She proceeded to fire the gun again and again, shooting him multiple times at point-blank range. One of the neighbors heard the gunshot and immediately called 911. Jonathan tried to run for his life, but his grandma ran after him and shot him down, making sure he was dead.
911, what's your emergency?
I've just been shot.
Where? Who?
I've just been shot.
Where are you at? What city?
West Bloomfield.
Okay, how did you get shot?
My grandma shot me.
Your grandpa shot you?
My grandma. I'm gonna die. Help.
Okay, we're gonna stay on the phone with me, okay, sir? I'm gonna get help on the way. Okay?
Help.
Where were you shot at? Where are you shot? Your chest? Okay, who, are your grandparents still there?
No.
Where did they go?
I don't know.
You don't know where they went, they shot you though, right? Okay, stay on the phone, okay?
I got shot again. Oh.
You got shot again? Are they still there?
The poor boy begged for help, but Sandra refused to listen, shooting him even when he was down on the ground, unable to move.
What are you trying to do?
Get away. Stop him.
So you're trying to get away from him. And why are you trying to get away from him?
Scared.
You're scared. What are you scared about?
He's gonna hurt me.
Jonathan made one last-ditch effort to save his life and called 911 to ask for help. In the recordings, he was heard talking about how his grandmother was shooting him before his voice trailed off, and Sandra can be heard yelling in the background. When the police arrived, the evidence against Sandra was too overwhelming to negate. Jonathan had died by then. She ended up admitting to her crimes, saying that she had done it out of self-defense when the two had gotten into an explosive altercation. Jonathan's phone call might not have been able to save his life, but it certainly put his murderer behind bars for good.
Sandra Layne is pure evil, and if given the opportunity, would surely kill again. She has no remorse or conscience. Her only concerns are for herself.
I don't know what else to say. I just don't know. I don't want to die in jail or prison. Please. I don't know what in my life in prison. I'm so sorry. I apologize to everybody.
The 911 recordings were enough for the court to incriminate her for her brutal murder, sentencing her to 20 to 40 years in jail with no possibility of parole, despite her constant appeals. Even Jonathan's parents went on to call Sandra pure evil. According to Jennifer, Sandra's daughter, her mother was capable of killing even more people if she was ever released.
She deserved a life sentence, and she's locked away forever and can't hurt anybody else.
How would you have described Sandra Layne before all this?
She was always a thorn in my side, to be very honest. She was very difficult, very meddlesome, very controlling, and I never liked her.
Do you think Sandra acted out after losing her patience, or was she just really selfish? Do you believe schizophrenia was the only driving force that turned Tamara into a mass murderer? Did society fail Dorothea? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. See you in the next video with more real-life horror stories.